So this is about where we left off in the last video, talking about the sort of pattern of family and social and political settlement in the New England colonies, and how they were a bit different than the colonies elsewhere in the Americas. So, also different than the Chesapeake Bay colonies, the New England colonies tended to travel as family groups. The Chesapeake colonies, if you recall, were mostly single young men coming over to work, and then later, once it became apparent the colonies would become permanent, they began to import women or marry sometimes Native American women. Not often, but it did happen. The New England colonies usually came over as family groups, and as such, much more stable from the beginning, and many more children survived, and the birth rate was much higher, and there was stability to create new families from people born in the colonies. This is an image of the Mason children. And it's a family portrait from the family of David Mason, and it indicates him here as the male heir. And you can tell he's the heir in a few ways. One, in the fact that he's, the larger and kind of more prominent figure. His clothes indicate status, and his little staff here would indicate status. It would usually be something carried by the head of household, but as a child, he's not yet the head of household. His sisters here, you can tell from their clothing and the ribbons and that sort of thing, in addition to David's clothing, that they are a well-to-do family, a wealthier family. Typically, women would cover their hair until they were married, especially younger women. But you can still tell this is a well-to-do family, a wealthy family, which shows that there was wealth in the colonies and status in the colonies. So his staff indicates his status as the male heir, and her rose here indicates childhood innocence, which means that she's, still a child and not yet a maid. This shows you some of the patterns of European migration from Europe to the colonies. Then it shows the intercolonial migration. So once you've established in, say, Boston, where do you move to elsewhere? And it shows you the early major population centers. So like I said, the East Coast was pretty densely populated. Boston being the major city, Plymouth, Scituate, Salem, Marblehead, Newbury as major colonies. In Connecticut, the Connecticut River Valley centered on Hartford and Springfield as major colonies. New Haven, Old Saybrook as major colonies. And you can also see some of the other colonies that may not be huge population centers yet, like Deerfield, Northampton, Hadley in Massachusetts, Worcester, Lancaster, Dunstable, also in Massachusetts, Danbury, a settlement in Connecticut, and you can see that the New York colony, again, this was not a English colony, this was a Dutch colony at the moment. And you can see that the pattern of settlement is slight. It's not especially dense. It's light settlement. These would have been very small towns. The only real city in the New England colonies would likely have been Boston, with the other places more resembling towns than what we would think of as cities today. These show you some of the major groups. So the West Country, the Scots-Irish, the Puritans, the Pilgrims, all different groups migrating for different reasons. The Scots-Irish and the West Country mostly for economic reasons, the Puritans and the Pilgrims mostly for religious reasons. And then you can see the intercolonial migration, so from Boston, north and south, from Boston to Rhode Island, and then from the Massachusetts colony to the Connecticut River Valley, and then into New York and Long Island. In this image down here, in what would be Sudbury, Massachusetts, which is just nothing that special about it, just a colonial town, you can see what these towns would have looked like. And the interesting thing is that although there was private enterprise and you have land held by private people or entrepreneurs or businesses, a lot of land was held in common. And the commonly held land would usually be farmland or pasture land. Also part of the commonly held land would be the meeting house. It would usually be on commonly held land, and that would be, again, both a religious and a political center. And you can see that, these are small settlements. 30, 40 houses, 4 or 5 main roads, a couple of smaller roads, and that's it. That's all it comes down to. Small in size, small in population. Most people making their living as farmers, with a smaller part of the population making a living as craftsmen of some kind. Also of note in the commonly held land is the mill. The reason the mill was held in commonly held land was a lot of smaller scale farmers who were farming the common pasture wouldn't have had enough money to buy their own mill. And without mill, you can't grind your corn or grind your wheat, and you can't make bread or cornmeal, so you can't eat. So for that reason, the mill had to be built on commonly held land. It's just another image of a colonial town. Again, notice this sparse settlement. Notice how much of it is given over to farmland and pasture. And notice the largest building in the city or the town would be the church. Again, the church serving this dual function of both a religious center and a political center. Okay. So the Pilgrims were a breakaway group from the Church of England, which was on its own a breakaway group from the Catholic Church. They were seen as too radical. Largely the practices between the Church of England and the Catholic Church weren't that different in practice. It was more in theory. And the Pilgrims wanted to have sort of a more radical religion. They were outcast because of their religious fervor, and regarded as heretics, regarded as radicals, and they fled to the New World. They still consider themselves British, which is important, because once established, they became a part of the British colonies, but they saw themselves as a breakaway group at the same time. They were heavily influenced by Calvinism, which we're not going to have a great deal of time to talk about different denominations in this class, but you should know that Calvinism, in brief, is the idea of predestination and God's power over all. Thus, it's already determined what your life's going to be, what it's going to be like, if you're going to heaven or hell even, is already predetermined. And the best thing you can do is live a good life and hope that you're predetermined to go to heaven. It may seem counterproductive, because if your fate has already been determined, couldn't you just do whatever you wanted? No, because God's power is over all, and He's going to make you live basically a good life. So you may as well try to fit into the good plan, the bigger plan. So again, too radical for the Church of England at the time, and not necessarily forced out, but certainly unwelcome. They also had the goal of converting the Indians or the Native Americans to Christianity, specifically their type of Christianity. So again, from the start, their settlement has a religious purpose built into it, and not necessarily an economic purpose. The economic purpose was secondary. This is again very different than the Chesapeake and Virginia colonies, where the colonies were primarily founded as economic colonies to produce goods for trade, not as religious centers. This shows you the voyage, the length of the voyage. It would be extremely long. We're talking weeks at sea at a minimum, 5-6 weeks, and quite possibly, depending on weather and sea current, months. on ships that were quite small. They're not like the size of our cruise ships today. They're quite small. Um, a very uncomfortable voyage. A lot of illness on the voyage. People becoming sick on the voyage. People dying on the voyage. Disease spreading very easily in the cramped quarters. The food would grow moldy and grow stale throughout the voyage. They'd be living on something that was called hardtack, which was basically bread that you'd bake and you'd bake and you'd bake again at fairly low temperatures, but continually bake it until it basically resembled sort of hard cracker biscuit things that would not rot. Not very tasty, hard to digest, and they also had the downside of attracting worms. So before you ate sort of the hardtack, you'd kind of have to tap it out to make the worms come out before you could eat it. So not a comfortable voyage, and you would consider the people making this voyage would have a lot of incentive to do so, either religious or economic. They're not doing it just because. It's an extremely difficult voyage. This is a recreation of one of the ships, recreation of the Mayflower, and this again shows you how crowded these ships would have been. Very small, crowded, dark. Again, a very unpleasant voyage. And when you consider that a lot of the families coming to New England were coming as family units, the husband with the wife and the children, you can imagine just how difficult and uncomfortable the voyage would have been. So let's change focus and talk about some of the other colonies. So the Carolina colonies. These colonies were, again, founded as an economic colony, so more similar to the Chesapeake Bay colonies and the New England colonies. The primary crop was rice after the 1690s, after it was introduced. And it was a plantation, meaning that most of the work was done on these large farms, generally owned by a family, with much of the labor being slaves. So the Carolina economy resembles the Caribbean colonies, even though they're not, a Spanish colony, in that you have a lot of African slaves working on these plantations. The poorer colonists who couldn't take part in the plantation system, because why would you pay colonists to work when you can have slaves work for free, moved to the northern part of Carolina and started their own colony, which would eventually become the difference between North and South Carolina. And the northern part, they raised tobacco and livestock and produced pitch, tar, and timber products. So again, the northern part would resemble sort of more the northern colonies, where the southern part would resemble the Caribbean economies, and the fact that they were plantation workers, slaves doing most of the labor, with a landed aristocracy kind of ruling over them. So that's it for this video, part 2. I was going to start the other video, but we're already at the 14-minute mark and there's not much sense to it. So I'll upload a third video, hopefully not a fourth, but a third for sure, where I'll start to talk about colonial culture.